Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and this is basically a spring reading wrap-up. I'm still not quite reading enough books to warrant monthly wrap-ups, and I'm just going to continue doing these kind of huge long reading wrap-ups at infrequent intervals. Today I've got 10 books I want to tell you about, 10 books that I read between April and June, and to make it a bit easier for you to navigate, I have of course included timestamps in the description box so you can go and jump straight to the book that you're interested in hearing about. Although, you know, if you want to watch the whole video, that's very kind of you as well. This recent batch of books that I read has been really heavily focused on historical fiction, which is interesting. It's not one of my top 3 favorite genres, but it is a genre that I enjoy occasionally, and I guess in April and May and June I've just been really diving deep into various types of historical fiction. The very first book that I read in this batch of books that I'm talking about is actually a German novel. It's called Die Glasmacherin and it's by Birgit Hermann. Now the title translates to the brackets female glassmaker, and it is a historical Black Forest novel. And if you're in any way familiar with German literature, if you're in any way familiar with the Black Forest, you know that there is a lot of historical fiction that centers on the Black Forest, at least that is sold in the Black Forest. I think people like to read about the place that they're from, the sort of area that they know, and the Black Forest is, generally speaking, a really beautiful background for historical fiction. It has a very rich history, it's got that kind of mystique about it, and cold and dangerous, and you can see how that makes just for a fantastic background and setting for a novel. So this particular novel set in, I should have written down the date, I want to say late 18th or early 19th century, and it centers on a village of glassblowers. Now, this village really exists, and all of the places that I mentioned in the novel really exists, most notably 2 monasteries, well, a monastery and a convent that play a big part in this story. And I found that really interesting. The story itself had its up and downs. If you've read some historical Black Forest fiction, you will be attuned to certain tropes of the genre, like, for example, young innocent girls getting pregnant the first time they get down to it with the neighbour's boy, and then children being born out of wedlock and huge scandals happening around that. It's all a bit soap opera, which generally speaking I don't mind, but it is such a cliche for this particular genre, and unfortunately that and other cliches are also part of this novel. Now the novel isn't just a historical novel, it is also a crime mystery, and there is this kind of thread of secrecy and mystique that weaves its way through the narrative. It's a good concept, an interesting setting, but kind of badly executed. And all of that together produced a novel that I enjoyed, but that I couldn't get lost in, you know, that I always kind of read with a slight amount of snark in my brain. It was very easy to predict where plot points were going. The whodunit mystery was very easy to predict as well. Partly that is because of the age-old problem of only having like 2 female characters in it, so that it's really easy to figure out where their storylines are going. All in all, it is a novel that I can only recommend if you're particularly interested in that specific genre, the historical Black Forest mystery novel. If not, then I say just give it a miss. I gave it 3 stars because, like I said, I did enjoy the reading experience for the most part, and I did make it to the end of the book. As far as I know, this novel hasn't been translated, so unless you speak German, you're not going to get the chance to read this one anyway. Let's move on to a novel that is also a historical novel that is described on the cover as a historical crime novel, but I don't actually find that the crime element is the defining part of this story. I'm talking about Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. Now, this book has already inspired a video that I did on accuracy and authenticity in historical novels and how much they matter. I will link that video in the description box if you're interested in that discussion. This novel is one of my favourite books I've read this year. Possibly my favourite book that I've read so far this year. It really blew me away. I'm about 15 years too late for the hype. More than 15 years, in fact. But I only really picked this up this year. I found this book in a charity shop a while ago. And it lives up to the hype. What can I say? This novel is set in Victorian London, well, Victorian England. It starts off in London and we follow a young girl who's kind of grown up in the dark and dingy underbelly of crime and, you know, theft and forgery. She grows up as the, I guess, adopted daughter of a woman who runs a baby farm, which was a real business, a real industry in Victorian London. So she grows up in these circumstances and then gets drawn into essentially a scam where she has to play the role of a lady's maid to a rich but naive young lady who lives in a big mansion in the countryside. Whew, just thinking about this setup makes me all excited about this novel all over again. So even if you haven't read this book, you can pick out the Victorian tropes in this. We've got, you know, an orphan growing up in London. We've got a rich lady in a well-protected manor house. We've got theft and mistaken identities and more plot twists than you can even imagine possible within a single novel. This is a beautiful piece of literature. It has everything you want a novel to have. It's got, it's got the plot twists, it's got some adventure, it's got vividly described world building and setting. It's got the most beautiful romance, the most heartbreaking romance. It is just such a masterpiece, and I cannot believe that I haven't come across Sarah Waters earlier. She is definitely going to be an author that I want to explore completely. I want to read every book that she's ever written because I was so blown away by Fingersmith. I even lent this book to my husband, who does not usually read, like, at all. The only books he ever reads are when I really force him to read a book. And when I say force, obviously I cannot force a grown man to read a book. What we do is this little trade where I give him a book that I want him to read and he gives me a video game he wants me to play, and then we do this little swap and I play the video game and he reads the book. Anyway, he was just as impressed by Fingersmith as I was. It is such an amazing novel. What can I say? 5 stars. Loved it. And thank you, by the way, to everyone who has recommended this novel to me, because I'm pretty certain that I only actually picked it up in the charity shop when I saw it because I had this title in my head as one that has been recommended to me in the comments section of this very YouTube channel. So any book that follows Fingersmith has to bring me down to earth, right? And it did. Again, it's a historical novel, and this time one that is set during prehistoric times. I'm talking about The Clan of the Cave Bear by Canon M50. Auel. I assume that's how you pronounce it. That's how you'd pronounce her name if she was German. So this, again, was on your recommendation because a while ago I made a video where I mentioned that I'd quite like to read a novel set in ancient or prehistoric times, and this fits the brief. This follows a young human who is adopted into a clan of Neanderthals. Don't ask me when, because I'm not a prehistorian. So I don't know when exactly in the chain of human and Neanderthal evolution this takes place. But basically this girl, Auel, grows up amongst Neanderthals while she herself is a modern human. This was a really interesting novel purely because of the setting, because so little is known about that period, and certainly so little was known about that period when this book came out, which I believe was in the 1980s. The author clearly has taken a lot of freedom with her world building, but at the same time making this society structure and the natural world and the way that people interact seem quite plausible. So for me, the world building and the setting and the setup of the story were really fascinating. The plot again let me down a little bit because it was very meandering. A lot of the characters felt quite two-dimensional. There were a lot of characters in the novel. It is quite a big book, but I feel like the author didn't give them all the space to form into fully fleshed out people, whether Neanderthal or not. And you can tell from the novel that this is the first in a series. You can tell that the author kind of expected the reader to continue on and to explore these people more and to continue following their lives. But I want a novel, whether it's part of a series or not, to be a contained unit. And unfortunately, that just didn't hit the spot. I still enjoyed the novel. This is another 3-star read. I had to overlook some very 1980s style plot developments that I think maybe wouldn't have been written that way if the book were published today. But taken as it is, it was a good novel. I enjoyed it, but not quite enough to actually continue with the series. So I won't be reading the next in the Cave Bear series. It was an interesting read. It's certainly a unique book. And I know that many people, especially people who grew up with this series, really loved it. It wasn't quite right for me, but enjoyable nonetheless. So another 3-star read. Then we take a little bit of a break from historical fiction and we go into some super localized fiction. Honestly, I don't know if this is really going to be interesting for you, the viewer, because this next novel is one incredibly local story set in my hometown. This book is called Das Keltenritual by Christof Weiglein, and it is set around one local landmark from my hometown, which is a Celtic burial site. Even calling it a landmark is blowing it completely out of proportion. It is essentially just a hilltop just outside of town. It's mostly frequented by teenagers drinking at night in the summer and illegal barbecuers. It is very uninteresting. It's just a hilltop, right? Because everything that was inside of the actual burial site has either been plundered or transferred to the local museum, and all that's left is just this kind of green grassy hill surrounded by some trees and some field. It is quite pretty. Anyway, this novel, it's a contemporary crime mystery, and it starts with the discovery of some bodies in the hill, but not ancient bodies. This is clearly a recent murder that has happened. So we follow the two detectives as they uncover this murder mystery and get drawn into some dangerous situations. You guys, this was unfortunately quite a bad novel. It had all of the tropes of the genre, but not much originality. Really, the main draw was recognizing the places, which was nice. You know, I'm many hundreds of miles away from my home, So reading a story where I know the streets and the places, the restaurants, the police station, not that I've ever been arrested there. It's homely and it's warming and it's lovely. And even some of the characters I can imagine being based on local celebrities, you know. Because in a small town, you know, the journalists and the police officers and the teachers and the local politicians. That was all lovely, but objectively, it wasn't a very good novel. The female characters were all absolutely atrociously written. There was just no real personality there. They were entirely devoid of character and only there to fulfill a function in relation to the male characters. They were cliches. The whole murder mystery, I mean, honestly, I didn't care about who did it in the end because it was so bland. And when I say that it was nice to see some of my hometown, it's a very whitewashed version of my hometown. Because even though I come from a small town in the middle of the Black Forest, it is more diverse than these kind of local novels make you think. I think the only suggestion that anyone other than white Germans live in my hometown was like one mention of a kebab shop, and that was it. And I know my hometown is much more than that. So I fought my way through the end of the novel, which makes it a 2-star read. If I DNF'd it, I would have given it 1 star. Honestly, cannot recommend unless you too live far away from that specific town and you're feeling a bit homesick. Next up, I read Matt Haig for the first time in my life. My friend and guest Spinster Robin is a huge fan of his fiction and non-fiction, I believe. And I picked up this book. It's called To Be a Cat, in a charity shop, of course. And it's a children's novel which features a boy who suddenly wakes up as a cat. You can tell that this is right up my street. It was a really fun novel. Of course, it's got kind of fun and adventure, but it's also quite dark. The villains in this are truly villainous and evil and horrible. And the plot's got some really interesting twists and turns. The characters are all fun and they feel like real people, or in fact like real cats when they need to be. But the author also doesn't shy away from making some of the characters quite camp and over the top. I know it's kind of a cliche to compare children's book authors to Roald Dahl, but this definitely has that mix of quirkiness and a real sense of danger, and I enjoyed it. I wasn't blown away by it, but it was a really fun read. If you like Matt Haig, or if you like books about cats, and why wouldn't you, recommend this one. I gave it 3 stars. My copy is going to guest Spinster Robin though, because she hasn't read this one yet. Then we go back to some German literature, and this one is a German 20th century classic. It's called Das kunstseidene Maedchen by Irmgard Keun. The English translation is The Artificial Silk Girl, and this one is in fact available in translation. This novel was published in 1932, and I have not read a novel quite like this one. It's a kind of diary style novel, but less structured, more like a first person stream of consciousness, wildly journaling type of novel. It is told from the perspective of a main character who is a teenage girl named Doris. She works as a secretary in a medium-sized town and spends her days seducing men, mostly so that she gets certain things that she likes, like jewelry and clothes and fancy food. She comes from quite a poor background, at least the little that she tells us about her family life makes it sound like she doesn't have a lot at home, hence why she is in work as well at such a young age. She has such a hilariously dry outlook on life. She sees the world in a very specific way. For example, men. I mean, if you want to hear an 18-year-old bitching about men, this novel has it all. She knows how to manipulate people in order to get what she wants, but what she really wants to do is live in the big city. So she packs up and goes to Berlin with a stolen fur coat and tries to make a life there. She really wants to be a movie star. A lot of things go wrong in her life. She doesn't quite end up where she wants to. And this book is really just an up and down of her life in Berlin. One day she's on an up, she's dating some rich guy. She's getting fancy food and drink, goes out partying at night and gets all the gifts that she wants to. And then the next day his wife comes back from holiday. So it's things like that where she goes from, basically living on the streets, sleeping in taxi cabs, to really having a taste of the riches and glamour of Berlin. And despite her being really quite an unlikable character, you end up rooting for her, you end up wanting the best for her, and you end up enjoying this kind of teenage wisdom that comes with youth and not giving a shit. And it's just beautiful, it's hilarious. This is really a book that makes you time travel. More than any of the historical novels that I've spoken about and that I will speak about in this video. This book really takes you to a different time and place. 100% recommend this book. I gave it 4 stars. I really love this one. I'm definitely going to explore Irmgard Keun's other writing. Like many authors of her generation, her books were banned by the Nazis and she had to go into exile. So her bibliography isn't as large as it would have been otherwise, but there are still a few novels that she wrote between the 30s and the 60s that I really want to explore. And finally, I want to talk about 4 novels, but I'm going to talk about them in the same segment because they are 4 books in the Mistress of the Art of Death series by Ariana Franklin. The first book is called Mistress of the Art of Death, and this one I also read on your recommendation because I was, I think, asking about recommendations for medieval set historical novels. And this is set in the late 12th century during the reign of King Henry II in England. However, the main character is not English but Italian. She's from the Kingdom of Sicily and she is a trained doctor. Now, if that sounds implausible to you, apparently it isn't, because the medical school of Salerno really did educate, train female doctors during that time. So our main character, called Adelia, is such a doctor, and she gets sent from Sicily all the way to England to solve a mystery, to solve a series of children's murders in Cambridge. As a whodunit, this was really fun. It's quite formulaic in the way you have, your lineup of suspects and clues and red herrings, and then by the end of the story, our detective finds herself in a precarious situation, and how is she going to get out of that? There is the plot twist reveal of the person who did it, and it's all fairly standard for a crime mystery. What made this book so much fun for me was the setting. And the way that setting was described, clearly the author has done a lot of research on the time period. She really brought the 1170s to life. I say that as someone who doesn't know anything about the 1170s, but she kind of placed her story within the time period really well. I also enjoyed reading about an Italian main character. Because I haven't read many books where the main character is Italian. So that was fun. I certainly felt for her craving for salads in England, because not much has changed since the 12th century. The Brits still really don't know how to make a good salad. Other than that, this was a really fun take on the historical mystery series. Now, when I say fun, I want to mention that it is quite a violent book. It is quite gory. It is quite brutal. That it's about children's murder, so of course it's not going to be light and fluffy. But those aspects of violence, brutality, and mystery are interspersed really nicely with some fluff, with some lovely characters, with some wonderful people, with some emerging friendships and relationships, and it's all good, and it's all a good mix. So I really enjoyed this novel. I gave it 4 stars. And I enjoyed it so much that in fact I instantly bought the other 3 in the series. I read this one on audiobook, by the way, so this is not from a charity shop, unfortunately. Then we get to the second novel, which is called The Death Maze. Now, I'm actually giving you the titles as they appear on Goodreads. I know that each of the subsequent novels also has an alternate title, which I'm not entirely sure why, but I will list both titles in the description box. I don't know if it's a UK-American thing, or maybe just a new edition versus old edition thing. Anyway, The Death Maze. Yeah, I didn't like this one quite as much. So we are still with Adelia and her friends in England. This time she is sent to investigate the poisoning of the king's mistress. I thought this one was trying to do the same things as the first novel, but didn't quite succeed in the same way. The new characters that appeared were just a bit two-dimensional. The mystery was a bit predictable. The villains, a bit too cartoony. And the setting just didn't make quite as much sense. Again, this one's built on real historical evidence. A lot of the people in the novel really existed, a lot of the places really existed, a lot of the events really happened, and the novel is really quite masterfully woven around those events, but I just wasn't taken as much by this novel as by the first. I gave it 3 stars. The third book in the series, called Grave Goods, for me that had a more interesting setup, because this one deals with the mystery of King Arthur. In this one, Adelia and her little clan of detectives is sent to a monastery that just recently burnt down at Glastonbury, where she has to investigate a pair of bodies that were found in the graveyard that are believed to be King Arthur and Queen Guinevere themselves. Other than some slightly dodgy depictions of Welsh people, this was an enjoyable novel. I only gave it 3 stars because the mystery of the 2 bodies was so predictable that even a crime fiction noob like me could figure it out very early on, and that just took a lot of the excitement out of the story. Nonetheless, still enjoyed it and moved on to the 4th, which is called A Murderous Procession. This is Adelia and her detectives going on a road trip to Italy. Yes, she is hired again by the king, or commanded by the king, to follow along with the king's daughter as she travels to the Kingdom of Sicily to get married to the King of Sicily. Again, this really happened. Joanna, daughter of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, did really marry King William of Sicily, and we were taken along on this journey. This one is less of a straight-up whodunit and more, I guess, falls more into the thriller category rather than detective mystery. And I enjoyed this one more than the third and the second novel. Apart from the ending, it's a very open ending. You could tell the author wanted to continue this series. Now, sadly, she died a few years ago and hasn't obviously been able to continue the series. So I'm going to disregard the ending. Did not like that at all. But again, we are introduced to some interesting characters. There's a sexy Irish pirate captain. There's some French Cathars who were a religious sect that were prosecuted very heavily in the Middle Ages. There's a Catalan duchess and her people. So this one almost felt like the most educational out of the 4 novels. I learned a lot about certain bits of history that I'd never heard of before. It was quite fun actually to go through this book, and then every time I came across like a new character or a new fact, I would go and Google that, and usually just end up reading the Wikipedia page for whatever subject I was looking for. And the road trip narrative really worked for me. I enjoyed that. The thriller and murder mystery kind of, I felt like, were more of a background noise in this novel. The villain, because in this one we actually get to see the story from the perspective of the villain as well as from Adelia's perspective. The villain chapters were as cliche as they always are in thriller and mystery novels, but they weren't in the way of the story, so I didn't mind them too much. But yeah, overall I really enjoyed this one. It was fun to see other countries in the 1170s, you know, we got to see a bit of France, a bit of Spain, a bit of Italy, and I gave this one 4 stars as well. I am really quite sad that this series didn't continue. So if you know of any novels that have a similar mix of fluff and education and mystery, then yeah, give me your recommendations, because I wouldn't mind something else to hit that same spot, to fill that same gap in my reading. Anyway, that was a lot of rambling. Let me know if you've read any of the novels I mentioned and what you thought of them. Thank you for watching. Bye.